now?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Oh, I can see you. Yeah, you look great.
Thank you.
It's quite warm in the US, isn't it?
I'm in Florida, so it's a rainy day today.
Oh.
But yeah, it's quite warm. I'm sorry. I don't want to make you envious.
You already did. Are you okay if we finish listening to Maria, or are you running out of time? Just let us know.
Oh, I see.
No, it's just she just finished her song and she wanted to finish with some sort of a poem she started with about the snow. Okay. Yeah. If you're fine, we're just finishing and then we'll just switch back to you.
Sure.
Everyone's writing you in the chat that they love your book and they're welcoming you anyway.
Oh, thank you.
All right, then we'll switch to Maria and then we'll come back to you.
All right, I'll be back.
Can you tell us a little about yourself, about what you're doing right now? If you are on some conference in the US where you're presenting some of your books, if it's secret, don't tell us anything.
I am staying with my family. This is my daughter's art desk behind me. And I am working on a science fiction book that someone else wrote that I've edited. We're in proof form. And I am reading or rereading the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin at the moment, which I recommend if anyone has not read them. Are they known in Russia? I don't know.
Урсула Ле Гуин, I believe so. Ребят, кто-нибудь у нас знает Урсулу Ле Гуин вообще? У нас известный персонаж. Кто в курсе science fiction у нас?
Yes, it is well-known writer.
You can probably, John, recognize Konstantin because I believe you are in writing, process of writing to each other, and it's very nice to have the author of the book of Tolkien's Worlds Today and also the translator of the book of Tolkien's Worlds Today, which is great. So you're both in the same room, so to say.
Okay, hi Konstantin.
Yeah. So Konstantin said that she's a well-known writer. Well, maybe some people have no idea who she is, but I believe many have, and many do. Yeah.
Well, go on. Sorry.
No, I believe they just love us too much. Well, what about your other books? What about your what about this book? Are you happy now with the way it's being published and being discussed and told about? Are you happy with it?
I'm delighted, really. It seems to be spreading around the world much faster than my previous book, Tolkien and the Great War. And I'm very, very pleased with it as a physical book. It's very beautiful, which is not all. It's my publisher's work with my help, the selection of the pictures and the way that the book is designed and laid out. Yeah, it's been largely a very good experience, especially now that it's over. Writing a book is always painful and difficult.
Is it different from the other books? Because I remember this story that you told me about the how you came to write this book that you had, and then your friend suggested that you would probably like the idea to just put it into another book. Is it different for you? Does it feel different?
I'm sorry, is it different from writing Tolkien and the Great War?
Yeah, from all the other books that you've written or are going to write, from all other materials.
The difference is that this one was suggested to me by someone else. It wasn't my idea, And my initial reaction was that I wasn't interested in writing about places that inspired Tolkien. But in fact, as I was researching a different book, I realized that I had already actually had quite a bit of material that would fit very well. And secondly, I realized that the theme of places that inspired Tolkien is a lot richer than it seems. Because, for example, you have to include cultures that inspired Tolkien, you know. You have to consider what a place means, you know. It's not just a point on the map. It's not just a piece of topography. It's it can be a place with history, with culture, and so on. And you have to consider whether and why any given place would have inspired Tolkien. There's a great deal of material on the internet which is not very stimulating, I think, where people say, oh, this place must have inspired Tolkien because it looks like something I imagine Tolkien's world to look like, you know, because oh, let's say since it's his birthday, right, today, there's a mountain range in South Africa which people are convinced inspired Middle Earth, all of it, right? And this is obviously nonsense because Middle Earth is a vastly varied world anyway, but also because there's no evidence that Tolkien visited those mountains, and if he did, he was no older than 3 when he did so. So in other words, it was a much richer subject than I originally realized. So I accepted the work, and I hope I've done it justice.
Did you check all of these small links that led to these places?
Do you mean, did I check all the claims that other people have made?
Yeah, I mean,
no. I mean, a couple of friends of mine in the British Tolkien Society very kindly provided me with a file of cuttings for me to look over many of the claims that have been made, and I found it was interesting. But in many cases, there will be very little to say about many of the claims, except, well, actually, Tolkien didn't go there, or Tolkien only went there after he wrote his major works, you know. So, for example, there are claims about the inspiration of parts of Ireland, which Tolkien visited, but he didn't visit those parts until after he'd finished writing The Lord of the Rings. So when people say this landscape is like Mordor, well, it may be like Mordor, but it can't have inspired Tolkien's descriptions of Mordor.
So you were basing your research on the list that the British Tolkien Society provided to you, or did you get in contact with Priscilla and the relatives, and I don't know, was it your own inspiration? How did you choose these places that you've chosen finally?
I read around the subject. I looked at, I'm a biographer, that's my real interest. So I looked at all the places I knew Tolkien had visited and considered them in the light of everything I know about what Tolkien wrote, which is, you know, I've read Tolkien quite thoroughly. So that was the basis of it. But a lot of these things had this research, some of it had begun when I wrote this book, which was, you know, that was published in 2003 in Britain, coming out in Russian soon. And the research for it began in 1998. So, for example, in the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien, there's a good deal about Tolkien's 1914 visit to Cornwall, which features in Tolkien and the Great War, because 1914 comes within the period. So I already had a considerable amount of material of my own that I thought was fascinating.
I see. I asked you today in how many languages the book was published, and you said that it was over 10. It's 10 plus UK and US editions, right?
Well, not already published, but either already published or going to be published in the next few months. So already being translated. I think right now, I think it's 3 or 4 have already come out, and the other 6 will be in the next few months. Yeah.
Do you supervise the process? Do you check on the translators? Maybe in the way that Tolkien did, like, don't translate this word this way because it doesn't translate this way.
All I can do is try to make myself available if translators want advice, and to try to encourage the publishers to make sure the translator gets in touch with me if need be, because it's a complex book. Tolkien is a complex subject, far more complex than most publishers will realize. So in some cases, yes, I've had good conversations. I had good conversation with Constantine, especially when he pointed out dozens of errors in the English text. Thank you, Constantine.
Dozens of errors? What do you mean? I mean, you use this word too much?
Mistakes.
Ah.
Things that will be corrected in later printing.
Ah.
Not huge errors, mostly, I think, but these things happen with when you write a complex book. Inevitably mistakes.
You didn't have Constantine with you because he's very thorough. He always checks all the posts that are
so I see,
right. If he reposts them, yeah. Yeah, it's up to the person who's checking, because all the things are reread and read and reread, and it's probably, if a person is interested in it and he's studying it, then he'll find the mistakes and point them out to you.
Well,
another question.
I think a translator reads a book more closely than anyone reads it except the author, right? So the book was read by a copy editor and a proofreader. Besides me, but I don't believe either of those people were experts in Tolkien. It was also read by some friends of mine who do know Tolkien well, but they weren't paid to read it. They were just so they read it. They pointed out some small points that I could change, which I did. But yes, inevitably mistakes creep in, and we know this from the Lord of the Rings. The many texts of the Lord of the Rings in English have been corrected and corrected and corrected over the years.
And you mean mistakes and errors like misconnections, or an object that starts at one end of the room and by the end of the text it's on the other end of the room without having changed position and things like that? Or
a variety of different mistakes, and spelling errors, punctuation errors, things like that. Nothing major.
No, I mean, just are those logical mistakes, or maybe with Tolkien, this were the time of the year when they were starting or going somewhere, or are these just misprintings? Because it's different.
I'll tell you what. I will confess, there was one error which was, I think, I think it's gone into print in English. There was one error of fact about The Hobbit, where I said that it is not stated in The Hobbit that the Carrock is an island. Right? And of course, when I then sat down and I read The Hobbit to my daughter, and I reached the passage where the Carrock is discussed after they've actually passed over it, and I had forgotten this passage, but it says quite explicitly that it's an island. So that was a frustrating moment for me.
Well, it's not frustrating because now you know that you found the passage, and now you know what to correct. I also wanted to ask you, do you know anything about the, the recent publications? Because even in Tolkien Society, there's so much talk about them changing the passageways. Like, there was this letter and this PS to it, and then we have the edition 10 years later now, where the PSs have changed. They have switched positions, and so we have to go back and check previous volumes. Mix-ups like that. Do you know something of this sort of thing? I mean, not with your books probably, but with Tolkien books.
I'm aware that the edition that was created by Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull has introduced changes on the basis of Tolkien's drafts, things that Christopher Tolkien pointed out in the History of Middle-earth. I can't comment on whether those are sensible changes or not. On the whole, I imagine they are.
Mm-hmm. I see. So what about you? We have a very huge success, I believe, here in Moscow. Do you know anything about this? Have you heard of this already, or do you have success like this in every country where you publish your books?
Well, I only know about my success in Russia because of what you and Konstantin have told me. And it's very hard for me to assess what that means because I don't know the Russian Tolkien community. As an author, of course, I look at numbers. So if I knew the numbers that have been sold, that would be a valuable thing, but we don't know that. I don't even know that for the English editions at the moment. My books do well enough, I think, in Germany, very well in Spain, I don't know why, and not very well in France. In France, there seems to be some kind of resistance to Tolkien. I don't know why, but yeah. Even though the French Tolkien Society, Tolkien Dill, is very active and very good, he seems to be a minority taste there.
Mm-hmm. I see. Does this take up much of your time? The translations, the way you make yourself available, do they bother you too much about the translations, or do you just, I don't know, talk to them once in a week when they tell you everything's ready? It's fine. Just take a look.
It's fine. Now that I've been through this experience a few times, I know that I want to help a little. It worries me if a translator does not ask any questions. But I know that there's a certain limit to how much I can help. So there was one translator who once said to me, who was once asking me so many questions about the text that I ended up saying, look, all you need to do is translate the text as it is. We can't create a whole new edition here, So I'm not going to say what language it was because I don't want to identify the translator, but I had to make sure that the job was a practical job that could be done without creating a new edition, which would have taken vast amounts of my time, It would have been like writing or revising my English text completely.
Konstantin is asking you in the chat whether he was from Hungary.
I'm not going to answer that question.
I see. I still have this question, why is this book important to you? This particular book, because I think you've answered multiple times why the previous books were important for you. But if you want to, you can answer this one too. Why is each one of your books important for you? In which way?
Okay, well, they're very different books. So as I've waved this book around already, this book is important to me because it's a way of bringing the dead back to life. It's a way of letting the dead speak. So it's about not only Tolkien, but also his three closest friends during the First World War and their friendship. And I found it fascinating and moving to bring their story to light from their letters. It's also important to me because it's the book where I first began my exploration of how and why Tolkien constructed Middle-earth. So it's like this chronological investigation that really fascinates me. This little book, which is only available from my website, Tolkien at Exeter College, is an extension of the same story, but focusing on Tolkien's life as an Oxford student. And that was important to me because I wrote it after Tolkien and the Great War. And I made some fresh discoveries, fresh insights into the very beginnings of Tolkien's invention of Middle-earth. In particular, that old question of whether Tolkien invented the language and then the story, or the other way around, right? Now, the worlds of J.R.R. Tolkien is important to me because, it's an extension of that same investigation. Although I'm talking about places, it's absolutely vital to understand when Tolkien visited them, because often you can see that has an immediate impact on what he wrote. Right?
Yeah, this I can understand.
And secondly, this book is important to me for a totally different reason, and that's simply because it's a beautiful book, which I hope Tolkien fans will be able to enjoy on many levels. So young Tolkien fans can enjoy it, even if they can't necessarily understand everything in it. Even if they haven't read the Silmarillion, they can still dip into it and read about the inspiration for hobbit holes, for example. And I hope it will do something that Tolkien has done for me, which is to encourage an interest in our world, in the history of our world, in the geology, the archaeology of our world, in astronomy, and all of these things.
I can understand how you check this with the places, comparing it with your knowledge of Tolkien. But what is completely mysterious to me from your speech is how you check with the languages, because we never know what word was in Tolkien's mind while he was working up this valley. So how do you check with the language, whether this was coming from language to a story or backwards? Although we have his quotes that when he says it's always about the stories to me and about the languages to me, and I have to hear a name and then I'll tell you a story.
All right. So the key point that was not available to me when I wrote Tolkien and the Great War was the story of Kullervo, Tolkien's adaptation of part of the Kalevala, the Finnish cycle of epic poems. That was published, I forget the year, 2010, I think, in Tolkien Studies, something like that, or 2007. And that showed that Tolkien was using something very similar to the Elvish language Quenya to create names for his characters. So he wasn't always using the original Finnish names for the characters or the places. He was using names in what was obviously a draft, a prototype version of Quenya. Right? So one example that will interest you is the name Kemenume, right? Which was Tolkien's word in the story of Kolavo for Russia. And it translates as the Great Land. It's Quenya, effectively. It's the language that, so the story of Kolavo was written in 1914. Tolkien began his Quenya lexicon, where he uses this language for the elves, in 1915. So it's very clear to me that here was the process. Tolkien wanted to try two things in 1914 with the story of Kolavo. He wanted to try using his own prose English writing to adapt an existing story, but he also wanted to experiment with putting one of his invented languages, because he had already invented many languages by that time. He wanted to experiment with putting one of his invented languages into a story, right? He didn't finish the story of Kolavo. And I think the reason he didn't finish it is because he realized that his invented language needed a story of its own. It needed more creativity. You know, it needed something that could come from within Tolkien or could come from many different myths and legends. And that is the vital step towards the creation of Middle-earth. In other words, yes, Tolkien was absolutely right when he said the invention of the language came first, the invention of the world and the history came second.
What are your further plans now? Are you planning probably a sequel to this latest book, or something completely different? Or if you cannot say, just don't say anything. If you can say something, please, because we are quite interested in what's gonna come for us.
I am at the moment talking to a publisher, well, talking to the same publisher, Francis Lincoln in Britain, about a book that I actually began in 2015, which I call Tolkien's Mirror, because it's about how Tolkien used Middle-earth as a reflection of the events of his own lifetime, the crises of the 20th century. So the First World War again, but also the Second World War, which is a very controversial subject, right? Because Tolkien tended to deny that The Lord of the Rings was influenced by the Second World War. The Spanish Civil War, the great dictatorships, all of these things will go into that book. So that's a book that's already partly exists in draft form, though it's quite a long time since I've been able to do any work on it. And I'm hoping soon that I will be able to get an agreement with a publisher, which will allow me to spend the time finishing the book.
So you already know how you can finish it?
Yeah, I've got a plan. I've got a plan for the whole book, and parts of it have already appeared in draft form in various conference papers and books, like books published by Walking Tree Press, for example. I've given talks on the Dead Marshes, on Tolkien's creation myth, and I've published papers on the story of Eärendil the Mariner. All of these things will be pieces of that book.
We have a couple of questions from other people. I think Konstantin got them quite well, so I'll just ask him to help me with these questions, if it's fine by him. Konstantin, can you hear me? I think we can unmute your microphone. ask Arseny to do this.
One moment.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, there were 3 questions for you. The first one was, could you please share your opinion on the movie Tolkien?
Okay. It's a very pretty film. It's not really much about Tolkien. It's one of those examples. Maybe there are many examples like this in movies where the adaptation is so free, so loose, that the original facts can hardly be recognized in it. Personally, I find it frustrating because my own project has always been accuracy. And I think only by being truthful and accurate can you convey the deeper truths properly. Filmmakers tend to think that they can ignore the surface facts and yet still show the deeper truth. So I think that's probably self-delusion. So the biopic Tolkien very closely covers the same period as this, but the chronology is different, the people are different, or in personality. You know, the personality of Tolkien's friends in the TCBS, they're quite different from what they were in life. And I feel that's a missed opportunity to start to tell a fine, powerful, moving, and insightful story. Sorry to the filmmakers who I believe, you know, made it with passion and, you know, good intent, but that's my view.
Thank you so much. We have already discussed that question with you, but the question is from other people now. The second question is it easy or difficult to take a look into the collections of the Bodleian Library and Marquette University?
I have not worked with anything at Marquette. I believe that access to all the Tolkien papers they hold there is very straightforward. That's not the case with the papers held at Oxford. So Tolkien's papers at the Bodleian Library are divided into unrestricted and restricted. And unrestricted is mostly his academic writings. Restricted is basically anything you would want to look at. so every, you know, all the Silmarillion papers are restricted still. And I have had a slow but positive relationship with the Tolkien estate, gaining permission to look at various things that have been important to my research, where I've been able to explain the importance of something, and eventually I've been allowed to look at it. So, for example, the letters between Tolkien and his friends during the First World War. You know, I mean, of course, one hopes that in due course, these restricted papers will become unrestricted. But in the real world, we work with the restrictions that there are. And honestly, there's plenty of Tolkien's work on Middle-earth that has been published in the history of Middle-earth, which has barely been considered by Tolkien fans and Tolkien scholars.
Well, thank you. And the third question is, which sources of Tolkien's inspiration and Tolkien's world are, in your opinion, the most underestimated by the scholars?
Oh,
Underestimated sources.
are we talking about things in my current book, or in general?
I suppose the question is in general. If you write that thing in your book, then people can buy it and read it there.
Yeah, right. There's just such a variety of different sources, and I don't think there's any one kind that has been underestimated. I would say that in general, there's a strange division between Tolkien scholars, literary scholars, who are very interested in Tolkien's medieval sources. And then on the other hand, those people I've mentioned before on the internet, for example, who want to say that such and such a place inspired Tolkien because it looks like they imagine Middle-earth. And between those two ends of the spectrum, there's a big gap, which is filled with stuff that I believe really did interest Tolkien and inspire him. You know, more recent literature, for example, you know, 19th century literature, which he read very deeply, places that he visited, the theme of my current book, the events of his own times. You know, I think all of these things have traditionally been neglected by scholars of Tolkien, and they've been neglected mainly because Tolkien himself tended to say that they were not his inspirations, right? So that the classic example is in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings, where he says effectively, no, this book is not an allegory of the Second World War. A statement like that has been, I think, very, very destructive for an understanding of Tolkien. And I don't mean to say one should simply ignore what Tolkien himself said, but I think one should listen very carefully and closely, first of all, to what exactly he meant, and secondly, what was the context of the statement. So his comment about Lord of the Rings not being an allegory of the Second World War, well, we need to understand what he meant by allegory. And secondly, we need to understand the context. And the context was that for years, he had been reading reviews of The Lord of the Rings and getting letters from readers of The Lord of the Rings telling him, oh, your book must be an allegory of the Second World War. And you can imagine how frustrating that would be to someone who created such a complex and rich book. To the extent, I think, that he felt that it would be destructive to say, yes, okay, the Second World War had some influence on it, because it would just confirm those readers in their rather basic and single-minded conviction that the Second World War was the most important thing.
Well, thank you, John. I suppose we have no other questions. So I want to thank you for all your wonderful books, and to those who didn't know your book, Tolkien and the Great War will be published in the end of this year in Russian.
Well, thank you for talking to me, and here's to Tolkien, the professor, as they say.
Yes. Thank you, John.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us. I think it was a great experience for everyone, because I saw that everyone was writing to you and trying to give you their impressions about how great your book is. And I hope you just, I don't know whether you had one eye on the chat, and if you didn't,
I'm
well,
just looking at it now. Thank you.
Yeah, because you see, there were a lot of questions, there were a lot of thank yous, and we started with Marinara saying that, oh, John, I have your book. It's the impression of having you here is just great for all of us, because you know, when we see someone who we all, it's like we know you already, because you know, we have your book here, so it's like we know you basically. So it's great to welcome someone who seems just to be so far from us, but who's so familiar to us.
Thank you very much. I hope to meet you in person sometime, all of you. All right.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Yeah, bye.